Number 1. Cowboy Wash. In the mid-1990s, a salvage crew was digging ahead of an irrigation project in the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Park in southwestern Colorado. The site carried the plain label 5MT 10010. It was a small ancestral pueblo and hamlet, the people once called the Anasazi, and it dated to around 1150 CE. What the team found inside 3 pit structures, the sunken rooms known as kivas, changed how we talk about the ancient Southwest. The floors held the scattered broken remains of at least 7 people. The bones told a procedural story. There were cut marks where muscle had been stripped. There were percussion fractures, the kind made to crack a bone open for the marrow inside. There was something archaeologists call pot polish, a faint abrasion left when bone is stirred against the wall of a cooking vessel. And there were burn patterns that matched cooking, not cremation. Think of it as a butchery sequence, written in stone. The decisive evidence came from a biochemist named Richard Marler. In the year 2000, he and his colleagues published a study in the journal Nature. In one cold hearth, they had found a human coprolite, a piece of preserved human feces. They tested it, and it came back positive for human myoglobin. Here's why that matters. Myoglobin is a protein found only in the heart and skeletal muscle of a human body. It has no business being in human waste. It can only get there if a person ate human muscle and digested it. A cooking pot from the same room carried the same residue on its inner surface. The act and the meal were chemically linked. The physical anthropologist Christy Turner had argued for years that cannibalism appeared across dozens of Southwest sites, roughly 40 of them, in his 1999 book titled Man-Corn. That phrase translates a word from the Nahuatl language, tlacatlaoli, a ritual meal of human flesh, and it hints at influence from far to the south. The method that made the case had been pioneered earlier by the anatomist Tim White, whose 1992 study of a site called Mancos worked out exactly how to read cut marks, breakage, and burning on human bone. The coprolite itself carried a second message. Whoever left it in that cold hearth had eaten almost nothing else, which fits a famine. And dropping human waste in the hearth of an abandoned home reads, to many researchers, as a deliberate act of desecration, a final insult left behind. Mainstream archaeologists tie the event to a brutal drought and the collapse of the Chaco world. Others suggest the dead were accused witches, processed as a warning. A more speculative view imagines ritualized terror carried north. The descendant communities reject the framing entirely. Whatever the cause, the team left that kiva shaken, and it was only the first. Number 2, the Crow Creek Massacre. On a bluff above the Missouri River, on the Crow Creek Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, sits a site labeled 39 BF11. It was a fortified village of the initial coalescent tradition, ancestral to the Araucara, and it was occupied around 1325 CE. In 1978, looters disturbed the ground and exposed something enormous. The University of South Dakota and the Smithsonian moved in for an emergency salvage dig, led in part by the archaeologist Larry Zimmerman, with the physical anthropologist P. Willie studying the bones. What they uncovered remains the largest known prehistoric massacre site in North America. Packed into the village's own defensive ditch were the commingled remains of at least 486 people. That number is a minimum count. The true toll was almost certainly higher. The dead were men, women, and children, but there was a strange gap in the population. Young women were missing in unusual numbers, which suggests the attackers took captives away rather than killing them on the spot. The violence written on the bones is hard to describe calmly. Roughly 90% of the skulls carried scalping cut marks across the crown. There was decapitation. There was dismemberment. There were noses and tongues and hands removed. The bodies had not been buried at once. Many bones showed gnawing from scavengers and weathering from the open air, which means the dead lay exposed for weeks, maybe months, before anyone gathered them into the ditch. Some skeletons carried older, healed wounds, proof that this village had been raided before the final attack came. They had built that ditch and a bastioned palisade because they were already afraid. Why did it happen? The bones also showed malnutrition, the enamel defects, and iron deficiency lesions of hunger that mark a population already pushed to the edge. Mainstream researchers point to climate stress and competition for shrinking farmland along the river. Some emphasize intertribal politics. A few reach for grander, cataclysmic narratives. The remains were reburied in 1981 at the request of the Crow Creek Sioux, years before the federal repatriation law existed. The crew carried the memory of it long after. This was a massacre. The next discovery was a community so frightened it turned on its own dead. Number 3. The Griswold Vampire Burial. In 1990, children sledding down a gravel pit in Griswold, Connecticut, broke through into a forgotten colonial cemetery. It belonged to the Walton family and held 29 graves dating from about 1757 to 1840. Most of the burials were ordinary. One was not. The grave labeled Burial 4 had been reopened years after the man inside had died. Someone had taken his skeleton apart and rearranged it. His skull and his thigh bones had been set into a pattern on top of his ribcage, in the shape of a skull and crossbones. Brass tacks on the decayed coffin spelled out the letters JB and the number 55, his initials, and his age at death. The state archaeologist Nicholas Bellantoni led the analysis, working with the physical anthropologists Paul Sledzik and Michael Park. The ribs carried lesions that pointed to chronic tuberculosis, the wasting illness that people of that era called consumption, and that detail unlocks the horror. New England in the early 1800s suffered what historians now call the vampire panic. When tuberculosis swept a family, killing one member after another, frightened relatives sometimes decided the first to die was not truly at rest. They believed the dead consumptive was somehow draining the life from the living. The remedy was to dig the body up. If the heart still held blood, they burned it. But JB55 had been buried for about 5 years. He was already a skeleton. There was no heart to burn. So they rearranged his bones instead, hoping to stop him from rising. This was not a pirate symbol. It was a folk attempt to kill a corpse a second time. In 2019, a DNA and genealogy study by Parabon Nanolabs and a military identification lab tentatively gave him a name, John Barber, a local farmer. A smaller grave nearby, marked NB13, may have held his son, Nathan. The phenotyping even predicted fair skin, hazel eyes, and freckles. This was an age before germ theory, when no one understood how the disease passed between people. Mainstream science sees a community terrified by contagion. Folklorists see a belief system at work. Either way, the team had excavated a town's fear, made physical. The next site preserved its dead far too well. Number 4, the Windover Bog Bodies. In 1982, a backhoe operator named Steve Vanderjagt was clearing a small peat pond for a housing development near Titusville, Florida. He noticed dark bones in the muck he was moving. Instead of pushing on, he stopped and reported it. That decision preserved one of the most important archaeological sites in North America. The pond, labeled 8BR246, turned out to hold burials between 6,800 and 8,200 years old from the early Archaic period. The Florida State University archaeologist Glenn Doran and his colleague David Dickel led the excavation from 1984 to 1986. The peat did something extraordinary. Its still, oxygen-starved, mineral-rich water stopped decay almost completely. The team found at least 168 individuals, deliberately buried in the pond bottom. Each body had been laid on its side, flexed, oriented toward the west, and staked down underwater with sharpened wooden poles so it would not float. Then came the detail that stunned everyone. 91 of the skulls still held preserved brain tissue. It had shrunk, but the structures were recognizable 7,000 years after death. Researchers were able to extract ancient DNA from that tissue. Among the oldest human DNA recovered in the Americas at the time. For that to happen, each person had to be buried within roughly 48 hours of death, before decomposition could begin, while the cool peat sealed them in. The pond gave up more than bodies. It held woven textiles, some of the oldest in North America, showing 7 distinct weaves. That means these foragers had sophisticated fiber technology more than 7,000 years ago. One adolescent had been born with spina bifida and had lived to about 15, which tells us the community cared for a child who could not fully care for himself. Preserved stomach contents revealed last meals of elderberry and other plants, a direct window into diet and the season of death. The team also recovered wooden artifacts and bottle gourds that had survived intact in the muck. The population was healthy, with strong teeth and a stable way of life. They returned to the same pond to bury their dead for generations, which means they held territory and kept ritual. The excavators described the uncanny feeling of lifting an ancient skull and realizing a brain was still inside. The site was reflooded, and most of it left untouched. The next discovery showed sacrifice on the scale of a city. Number 5. Mound 72 at Cahokia. Across the river from modern St. Louis in Illinois stood Cahokia, the largest city in the Americas north of Mexico. At its height, around 1050 to 1200 CE, it held perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 people. Between 1967 and 1971, the archaeologist Melvin Fowler excavated a modest ridgetop mound called Mound 72. Beneath the quiet grass, he found at least 272 burials, arranged in a series of mass graves. Some were honored dead, many were sacrificed. At the center lay what became famous as the beaded burial. A high-status individual had been placed on a cape sewn with more than 20,000 marine shell beads, shaped like a falcon or birdman. For decades, the story was a single paramount male chief. Then, a reanalysis in 2016 showed the central burial actually included male and female pairs, and the older narrative had to be rewritten. Around these central figures lay the victims. One pit held 53 young women, aged roughly 15 to 30, apparently strangled and laid out in neat rows. Another held 4 men with their heads and their hands removed. A separate grave of about 39 people was the most disturbing of all. Some of them had not been dead when they went in. Their fingers had clawed into the sand as they tried to climb out. Strontium isotope analysis, including work by the researcher Philip Slater, showed that many of the victims were not local. They had grown up elsewhere and were brought to Cahokia, possibly as tribute or as captives. The burials were staged in episodes over time, tied to ceremonies that reinforced the power of the elite. The marine shells had traveled from the Gulf of Mexico, proof of a long-distance trade network. The Birdman imagery connects to a wider Mississippian belief system tied to the sky and to warriors. Mainstream interpretation reads this as political theater, a display of centralized, coercive authority. Some scholars stress religion over politics. A few push fringe ideas of outside influence. Whatever the motive, Mound 72 shattered the gentle image of loosely organized chiefdoms. The next discovery was older than almost any human remains on the continent. Number 6. The Spirit Cave Mummy. In 1940, the archaeologists Sidney and Georgia Wheeler were working in a dry rock shelter called Spirit Cave near Fallon, Nevada, in the Great Basin. They found the naturally dried-out remains of an adult man wrapped in a shroud of woven rabbit skin and reed matting, with woven moccasins on his feet. The arid air had preserved skin and hair. The Wheelers guessed the burial was perhaps 2,000 years old, and the remains went into storage at the Nevada State Museum, where they sat, largely forgotten, for over half a century. In 1994, someone finally radiocarbon dated the textiles and the body. The result was staggering. The man had died about 10,600 years ago. That made Spirit Caveman the oldest known natural mummy in all of North America. He had stood around 5 feet 2 inches tall, died in his late 30s or 40s, and his skeleton recorded real suffering. He had a healed fracture on his skull and several dental abscesses, painful infections that may even have contributed to his death. Handling him was like touching the deep past directly. The date set off a long and painful legal fight. The Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe sought to bring him home for reburial under the federal repatriation law known as NAGPRA. The Bureau of Land Management at first denied that the remains could be culturally linked to any living people, and the dispute dragged on for roughly 20 years. The resolution came from genetics. Between 2015 and 2016, a team led by the geneticist S.K. Willerslev sequenced his genome. The DNA showed that Spirit Caveman was most closely related to modern Native Americans, including the very tribe that had claimed him. That finding also refuted fringe claims, raised during earlier debates over Kennewick Man, that the first Americans were some unrelated population. He was returned to the Fallon Paiute Shoshone and reburied in 2016. His case became a landmark in the ethics of ancient DNA, a turning point in how consent is handled. His diamond-plaited textiles are among the oldest in the hemisphere. The next find sat beneath the streets of a living capital. Number 7. The Templo Mayor Child Sacrifices. Beneath downtown Mexico City lies the buried heart of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. In 1978, electrical workers digging behind the cathedral struck a massive carved stone, the dismembered goddess Coyolxauhqui. That accident launched the Proyecto Templo Mayor, led by the archaeologist Eduardo Matos Moctezuma. The Templo Mayor was the great temple of the city, crowned by twin shrines, one to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and one to Tlaloc, the god of rain. Over the following decades, the team excavated more than 200 offering caches, holding thousands of objects, and some of those offerings were almost unbearable to uncover. In one cache, labeled Offering 48, the team found the remains of around 42 children, most of them between 2 and 7 years old. They had been sacrificed to Tlaloc, the rain god. The Aztecs believed that the tears of children could summon rain, and so children were chosen for the offering. Some had cranial deformation, a marker of how their short lives had been shaped. In 2006, the excavators uncovered a colossal monolith of Tlaltecutli, the earth goddess, carved in the act of devouring, shown dismembered. The stone weighed about 12 tons and measured roughly 4.2 by 3.6 meters, one of the largest Aztec monoliths ever found. Beneath it lay rich offering caches and the hope of a royal tomb that has still not been confirmed. The dig recovered a skull rack and sacrificial knives, physically confirming the Spanish accounts of mass human sacrifice that some scholars had long suspected of exaggeration. Cut marks on bone match the descriptions of heart extraction and decapitation found in the codices. Isotope and ancient DNA studies show that some of the victims were not local, brought from distant provinces. Nearby, a structure called the House of Eagles yielded life-size ceramic eagle warriors and statues of Mictlantecutli, the god of death. Working in the dense urban core meant constant tension between archaeology and the modern city above. Mainstream researchers read the sacrifices as state religion bound to agriculture and power. Others stressed drought and crisis. The team described the children's remains as the hardest thing they ever lifted from the ground. The next site swallowed its offerings whole. Number 8. The sacred cenote of Chichén Itzá. In the Yucatan of Mexico stood Chichén Itzá, a great Maya and Toltec city that flourished from roughly 800 to 1200 CE. At its edge opens the sacred Cenote, a natural limestone sinkhole about 60 meters across, with dark water some 20 meters below the rim. A raised causeway connected the city's main pyramid, El Castillo, directly to this pit, marking it as a place of ritual. In the 16th century, the Bishop Diego de Landa wrote that the Maya threw people and treasure into the cenote as offerings to Chac, the rain god. For a long time, that was treated as half legend. Then, between 1904 and 1910, an American named Edward Herbert Thompson bought the site and went after the truth in the most direct way possible. He dredged the cenote with a bucket and even descended in a hard hat-diving suit into the murky water. He pulled up gold, copper, jade, carved shell, rubber, copal incense, textiles, and wood. He also pulled up people. The remains of more than 100 individuals came out of the muck, including many children and young adults. Later analysis, including work by the scholar Clemency Coggins, dismantled the romantic myth that only beautiful young virgins had been sacrificed. The dead were a mix of ages and sexes. Many skulls showed trauma inflicted at or near the time of death, and some bones bore cut marks suggesting flaying or dismemberment. The treasure told its own story. Much of the gold was not local. It had traveled from as far as Panama, Costa Rica, and central Mexico, which means the cenote drew pilgrims and offerings from across Mesoamerica. Thompson shipped many artifacts to Harvard's Peabody Museum, which later sparked long ownership disputes with Mexico. In the 1960s, a joint expedition by the diving group Sea Dam and the National Geographic Society returned, using an airlift and chemical clarification to clear the water, and recovered thousands more objects. To the Maya, cenotes were portals to Xibalba, the underworld. Drought during the Terminal Classic period may have intensified the sacrifices, as crops failed and people begged the rain god for relief. The children's bones confirmed a practice long treated as folklore. The next horror was far more recent and far colder. Number 9. The Donner Party Camp. In the winter of 1846 to 1847, a group of about 87 American immigrants became trapped by early snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. They had gambled on an unproven shortcut called the Hastings Cutoff, and it cost them weeks they did not have. Stranded near Truckee Lake, now called Donner Lake, and at a second camp at Alder Creek, they slowly starved. Only about 48 of the 87 survived. Survivor testimony and the reports of the rescue parties described the unthinkable. To stay alive, some of the trapped immigrants had eaten their dead. For more than a century, that story lived in legend and sensational retelling. Then archaeology stepped in. In 2003 and 2004, a team led by Kelly Dixon and Julie Shablitsky excavated the Alder Creek campsite, the Donner family camp. They located a cooking hearth and recovered thousands of tiny burned and shattered bone fragments. The bone had been boiled and then calcined, heated until it was brittle and white, the signature of people extracting every last calorie of grease and marrow. A 2010 analysis led by Gwen Robbins. Shug identified the fragments that could be identified as cattle, deer, horse, and dog. Most were simply too broken to name. Here the science needs care. The dig did not find clearly identified human bone at Alder Creek. That absence does not disprove cannibalism. It shows the order of desperation that the families consumed every animal first, processing the bone to nothing, exactly as starvation forces people to do. The written record, including survivor accounts, attests to cannibalism in the camps. The archaeology grounds the legend in physical evidence of suffering rather than confirming the lurid stereotypes that grew around the group. The team also recovered ordinary human things, ceramic fragments, a slate writing pencil, gun parts, the debris of families trying to live normally in an impossible place. They had to carefully separate the 1846 hearth from later activity at the popular, much-visited site. The excavators spoke openly of the emotional weight of working ground where children had frozen and starved. The final discovery is the most visceral monument of all. Number 10, the Aztec Tower of Skulls. The Aztecs built structures called tzompantli, wooden racks on which they displayed the severed heads of sacrificial victims. The Spanish conquistadors who entered Tenochtitlan, including Andres de Tapia, claimed to have seen a great rack holding tens of thousands of skulls. For centuries, many historians assumed the soldiers had wildly exaggerated. Then the ground gave up the truth. Beginning in 2015, during excavation behind the Metropolitan Cathedral in Mexico City, an INA team led by the archaeologist Raul Barrera Rodriguez uncovered the Huey Tzompantli, the Great Skull Rack, and something the chronicles had not fully prepared anyone for. Beside a platform of skulls stood two round towers, built entirely of human skulls bonded together with lime mortar. By 2020, archaeologists had counted more than 600 skulls, and many more remain unexcavated. The towers measured roughly 5 meters across, with the skulls facing inward. When the team examined them, the assumption that these were all captured warriors collapsed. The skulls belonged to men, but also to women, and even to children. Many carried drill holes on the sides, where they had once been strung on horizontal poles, displayed on the rack before being defleshed and finally mortared into the towers. The bioarchaeologist Ximena Chavez Balderas studied the cut marks and the careful, stepwise processing of each head. The structure was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. A skull rack served two purposes at once. It honored the gods, and it terrified everyone who saw it, enemies and visitors alike. The towers date to roughly 1486 to 1502, during the reigns of the rulers Ahuitzotl and Moctezuma II. Estimates of the total number of skulls on the full rack and towers run into the thousands. All of it sits directly beneath the busy heart of modern Mexico City, layered under the colonial cathedral and the streets above. Isotope studies are now trying to trace where the victims came from, testing the ideas of tribute and captives. The skulls had been defleshed and modified only after spending time on display, which tells us the rack was maintained, curated, almost tended. The find did what archaeology does best. It took an account that scholars had dismissed as conquistador exaggeration and made it undeniable, skull by skull. 10 discoveries, 10 places where the ground held something people would rather not have found. Now look at what they share. Step back from the 10 sites and patterns begin to surface. The first is climate. Drought shadows Cowboy Wash, where the Chaco world was collapsing. It shadows Crow Creek, where hunger marked the bones. It shadows the Maya Cenote, where failing rains may have driven desperate offerings. When the environment turns hostile, human behavior turns with it. The second pattern is power. At Cahokia, at the Templo Mayor, and at the Skull Towers, sacrifice was not hidden. It was staged, public, and political, a theater of authority meant to be seen. Killing became a language that elites used to speak about their own control. A third thread is disease and the fear it breeds. The Griswold vampire burial is not about violence at all. It is about a community so frightened of tuberculosis, which it could not understand, that it dug up and rearranged its own dead. A fourth thread is starvation, the raw arithmetic of survival that links the Donner Party to the darkest readings of Cowboy Wash. And a fifth thread is preservation itself. We only see Windover because of peat chemistry, and we only see Spirit Caveman because of desert air. The horror survived because the conditions were rare. Notice, too, how these discoveries were made. a backhoe operator, electrical workers, children on a sled, looters. Almost none of these sites were found by careful design. They surfaced by accident, which raises a quiet question about how much still lies unfound beneath our roads and fields. The violence is not the property of one culture or one era. It appears in the 11th century and the 19th, in the desert and the swamp, in the Maya South and the Mississippian heartland. Together, these sites dismantled a comfortable myth, the idea of a peaceful past untouched by organized killing. The tools that revealed all of this, the study of bone wear, the chemistry of isotopes, the reading of ancient DNA, are the same across every site. They turn rumor into record. But there is a cost to that work, and it is not paid only by the dead. It is paid by the people holding the trowel. The title of this story makes a promise, and it is time to keep it. These discoveries did not just disturb the public. They marked the people who made them. At Crow Creek, crew members reportedly struggled with what they had unearthed, and some sought support to process the scale of the killing. This is not weakness. There is now a real body of research on trauma in forensic and conflict archaeology, on what it does to a person to spend months in close contact with the violently dead. Consider the specific burdens. At the Templo Mayor and the Cenote, archaeologists lifted the small bones of sacrificed children one after another. At Windover, they cradled 7,000-year-old skulls and felt the weight of preserved brains inside. At Cowboy Wash, they had to prove, carefully and against fierce resistance, that human beings had eaten other human beings. At Griswold, they opened a grave that a frightened town had deliberately desecrated. Mass graves affect excavators differently than single burials. The repetition wears on a person. The slow pace of careful archaeology, the very thing that makes the science good, also means long, unhurried exposure to the dead, day after day. There is a constant tension in the work between detachment and empathy. A good excavator must record with cold precision, yet cannot fully stop feeling. Field schools do not always prepare students for that. Often the descendant communities are watching, which adds a moral weight to every decision about how to handle their ancestors. Some of these projects changed careers and changed lives, and a few researchers left fieldwork entirely after them. Media sensationalism adds its own pressure, turning a careful excavation into a lurid headline that the team never asked for. Researchers learned to sit with the discomfort, to treat the remains not as specimens, but as people who once breathed. Part of why some sites are reburied, rather than displayed, is precisely this recognition. The public hungers for the macabre, but the people who actually uncover it carry a quieter, longer shadow. And that shadow leads directly into a harder question. Once you have disturbed the dead, who decides what happens to them next? In 1990, the United States passed a law that transformed archaeology, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, known as NAGPRA. It required institutions to return Native American remains and sacred objects to affiliated tribes, and it shifted the balance of power over the dead. Spirit Caveman became one of its landmark cases. For roughly 20 years, the Fallon Paiute Shoshone fought to bring him home, against a government that first denied any connection, until genetics proved the link, and he was reburied in 2016. The earlier Kennewick Man dispute had set the stage, a long battle that ended when DNA confirmed native ancestry, and those remains too went home. Crow Creek was ahead of its time. Those 486 victims were reburied in 1981 before the law required it, at the tribe's request. Other cases remain tangled across borders. The treasures Edward Thompson pulled from the sacred cenote went to a museum in another country, and the question of who owns them has never fully settled. In Mexico, the agency INAH holds stewardship over sites like the Templo Mayor and the Skull Towers, balancing science heritage, and national identity. Underneath all of this runs a genuine tension. Ancient DNA can reveal astonishing things: the origins of the first Americans, the truth of ancestry, the movement of ancient peoples. But sequencing a genome means sampling a person who never consented, and for many descendant communities, that is a violation, not a discovery. The geneticist Eske Willerslev became known for a different approach, working directly with communities and seeking their consent before testing, treating the descendants as partners rather than obstacles. The ethics have shifted from extraction toward partnership. The cost of the old extractive model is still being counted in collections taken without permission and ancestors held in storage drawers for decades, exactly as Spirit Caveman was. Museums now reconsider what they display. Tribal historic preservation offices sit at the table where decisions are made. The old model, in which a scientist simply took what the ground offered, is fading. What replaces it is slower, more negotiated, and more humane. And even as those rules tighten, an enormous amount remains buried, waiting, beneath cities and farmland and quiet ponds. None of these stories are finished. At the Templo Mayor, the dig continues, and every season brings new offerings out of the ground, with archaeologists still hoping to find a confirmed royal tomb beneath the Tlaltecutli monolith. At the Huitzompantli, the more than 600 counted skulls are only the part that has been exposed. Many more are still locked inside the towers, unexcavated. At Windover, most of the burials were deliberately left in place, sealed under water, preserved for a future with better methods. The sacred cenote still hides material in its depths, now studied with sonar and controlled diving rather than crude dredging. Old questions stay open. Researchers still debate why Cahokia collapsed and emptied by around 1350, with new environmental coring testing ideas about flood, drought, and deforestation. They still argue about how widespread Southwest cannibalism really was, and whether the Cowboy Wash event was famine, warfare, or terror. Isotope studies on the Tzompantli and Templo Mayor victims are ongoing, slowly mapping where the sacrifice came from and how far the empire reached for its offerings. Archaeologists keep searching for more initial coalescent sites that might reveal whether Crow Creek was unique or part of a wider age of violence. The methods themselves keep advancing. Ancient DNA techniques now reopen collections that were excavated decades ago, pulling new stories from old bones. Proteomics, the same family of methods that detected human myoglobin at Cowboy Wash, grows more sensitive every year. Aerial laser scanning, called LiDAR, is revealing unrecorded sites, hidden under forest and soil, which means the map of what lies beneath is still being drawn. And there is a deliberate choice in much of this. Increasingly, archaeologists leave sites buried on purpose, judging that preservation matters more than satisfying curiosity now. Every answer these places give tends to raise a new question. The ground is not done speaking, which leaves one last thing to sit with. There is a simple truth running under all 10 of these discoveries. The ground remembers what people tried to forget. A town tried to bury its terror with a rearranged skeleton, and the earth kept it. An empire tried to turn killing into glory, and the earth kept that too, skull by mortared skull. The dead do not stay silent forever. Sooner or later, a backhoe, a sled, or a careful trowel brings them back into the light. It would be easy to treat these sites as nothing but horror, a catalog of cruelty. They are more than that. Sacrifice and massacre sit alongside evidence of deep human resilience and belief, of communities that cared for a disabled child 7,000 years ago, of people who wove fine cloth and carried gold across a continent and held their rituals through centuries of crisis. The same record that holds the worst of us also holds the most human of us. The archaeologists who uncover it stand in a strange position, as intermediaries between the living and the long dead, ask to be both scientists and witnesses. We are drawn to these stories for a reason. There is a difference between sensation and understanding, between gawking and reckoning. The value of confronting a site like Crow Creek or the Templo Mayor is that it refuses to let us pretend the past was gentle, and it asks us to see the dead as people rather than data points. Each bone was a life. Each offering was a choice made under pressures we can only partly imagine. The shift now underway, from extraction toward stewardship, from taking toward asking, is the slow work of honoring that. Much of the map is still blank. There is still ground that has not been opened, and there are descendants who deserve a say in whether it ever is. So the invitation is not to look away, and not to dig recklessly, but to keep looking, carefully, with respect for the cost. Because in the quiet after the trowel stops, what remains is not just a discovery. It is a person, found at last, and finally given the recognition the living owed them all along.